Preparing for a referendum that could result in the world's newest country, the north and south of Sudan now have a framework for some thorny issues. As millions of South Sudanese begin registering for their long-awaited independence referendum scheduled early next year, what are the chances of concluding a peaceful poll and honouring its results? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm James Bays. The African Union says both the north and south of Sudan have committed to their framework leading up to the long-awaited referendum on whether there should be independence for the south. They've agreed to maintain a soft border permitting movement of people and goods between the two sides. Meanwhile, thousands of South Sudanese began registering for the referendum that will seal their fate. Harun Mutasa is at one of the registration centres in Juba.
The countdown to next year's referendum has started, and people in southern Sudan are getting ready. Some hope it will be a fresh start for the war-torn region.
I want to cast my vote because it's important to me. First of all, I've suffered a lot and I've seen my people suffer.
Preparing to register voters has been a logistical nightmare. Southern Sudan is one of the poorest places in the world. Transporting registration material has been challenging. Some in the international community are concerned the South won't be ready by January, but a postponement seems not an option.
We are determined to accomplish or to respect the date on the 9th. That's why now we are beginning on the 15th, and by the 9th of January, the people are going to cast their ballots.
The priority now is to encourage as many people as possible to register. People have until the 1st of December to line up and register to vote. Now, they have to register if they want to participate in next year's referendum. The process seems pretty quick and pretty simple. They come to one of these registration centres where they give their details and their IDs. It's written on this form, and then they have to dip their finger in this indelible ink. This is proof that A, they've registered, and B, they can't register again. Now, it's been a long road for Southerners to get to this point. Some have waited 5 years to be able to choose whether to vote to separate from the north or to remain a united country. Logistically, it's been a nightmare. The referendum will only be considered legal if 60% of those who register actually show up on voting day. Political campaigns sometimes go late into the night as politicians try to gather support. Officials in the south hope people here vote for secession. Those in the north want Sudan to remain one country. The race to see which side eventually wins is intensifying. Harun Mutasa, Al Jazeera, Juba, Southern Sudan.
Joining me now are guests on this subject from Juba, a city that could become the world's newest capital, the official spokesman for the government of South Sudan, Barnaba Marial Benjamin. And here in our studio in Doha, Mohammed Ibrahim Shoush, the cultural advisor to the Sudanese embassy in Qatar. And finally in London, John Ryle, chair of the Rift Valley Institute specialising in Eastern Africa. John is also a professor at Bard College in New York. Gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with you, Professor Ryle. Your institute recently published a report about the referendum called The Race Against Time. Can this poll take place on time, and can it be done peacefully?
I think it's possible. Remember, we're talking about two polls. We're talking about a referendum in southern Sudan and a separate referendum in Abyei, which is this disputed area between north and south. And I think the southern referendum, as you mentioned, registration has begun. Registration is a very important process, obviously, in any election. It has begun. It's late. The timetable has been compressed. It's very difficult. As you mentioned, the terrain is difficult. People are widely scattered, and not all southern Sudanese voters are actually in southern Sudan. A lot of them are in northern Sudan. They have got quite a lot of logistical assistance from the UN. There's been a certain degree of disorganization, and I think it's still touch and go. But I think it is possible for this to happen on time.
A bit of a logistical nightmare, though, isn't it, Mr. Benjamin? Just 55 days to go.
Absolutely. As you know, when people think about registering for a referendum for the people of South Sudan, this is a population that waited for the last 50 years to see this hour come. So psychologically, people are completely prepared, and I'm sure despite some logistical difficulties, as said by Professor Ryle, definitely the referendum can still go ahead in time. One thing in our favor now, this is the end of the rainy season, so the mobility of our people will be easier. Secondly, we are going to hold a referendum, especially when we have gone through one of the most difficult elections the last year in April, which is a rainy season. And yet we could make that one of the most difficult elections ever seen anywhere on earth, but we successfully ended it. But I can tell you the logistical problems are not unsurmountable. We will be able to resolve this. We have kicked off today throughout the whole of South Sudan, including our counties. They have actually gone and are going to register quite comfortably without any hullabaloo or anything of the kind. So I'm sure it will be on time. We do recognize the challenges, and these challenges we can be able to resolve them with the help and cooperation of international community, especially international partners and the United Nations.
Mr. Shoush, a referendum in under 2 months, is it doable or is there likely to be a delay?
I think there's a different kind of opinion between the southern government and the government of Sudan as to the viability of the referendum on the 9th. The SPLM seemed to insist that we should keep to the schedule, which is the 9th of January. In fact, the government's stand is that it is for the benefit of the southern Sudan that the referendum should have all the facilities to become acceptable, to have all the conditions that will give the southerners the ability to form their opinion and to express them.
But Professor Ryle, these aren't just logistical challenges. There are all sorts of things to be agreed, including the borders of what would end up being a brand new nation.
That is true, and it's a very important issue, as has been mentioned in the framework agreement you mentioned that was negotiated by the African Union between the two parties. But it's not necessary to demarcate borders in order to hold the referendum. You have to bear in mind the difference between demarcation and delineation. Delineation is drawing a line on a map. It's roughly clear where the borders are. Demarcation is marking them on the ground. That's a very, very important issue for the future relations between the countries, but it's not vital in order to hold the referendum.
Mr. Benjamin, how important for you is it that these issues are resolved before polling day?
First of all, there must be a spirit of the comprehensive peace agreement from both parties, that is the National Congress Party and the SPLM. And we, as the government of South Sudan, we have been maintaining that type of spirit, that peace must be maintained. Secondly, we have got a political agreement on the border, that the border shall be as it stood in 1st January 1956. It means politically we have agreed where the demarcation of the border can be done. Thirdly, as you know, there are many countries, former Soviet Union, today Ukraine and Georgia, have become independent from Russia while they have not yet even drawn their borders. So as long as there is goodwill between the two parties, and as long as we have politically agreed that there's a border, which is 1/1/1956, I think it is for the technocrats to go on the ground and mark those borders. Thirdly, we have the Anglo-Egyptian administration, the British and the Egyptians were there. They have the maps in their archives where it was marked clearly what the boundaries of these provinces were. So really we can still go ahead with the referendum, and at the end of the day, hoping for a post-referendum good relationship, enhancing our trade, our businesses. I'm sure this process is the challenge we can overcome. We can still go ahead with the referendum, because the referendum has no borders. We are even going to have those in London and those in America and Australia and Canada that are going to vote. That of course is even out of the borders of South Sudan. So the issue of border is really not the issue, as long as we are agreed.
Mr. Benjamin, though, you talk about goodwill between both sides. Professor Ryle, is there goodwill? Because there's a lot of talk about this peaceful process, but at the same time, there are repeated reports of extra arms being brought into the south, extra troops from the north massing near what will be the borders.
Well, I think all countries tend to maximise their defences at times of political tension. Perhaps we shouldn't talk about goodwill so much as recognition of the reality of the situation. And I think there's an increasing recognition on all sides that the referendum is going to happen. It will almost certainly result in a vote for secession, and therefore, in due course, there will be two separate countries. It's very difficult, I think, for people in the northern Sudan to accept this. And southern Sudan, as Dr. Benjamin said, southern Sudanese have been fighting for a long time, broadly speaking, with the idea in mind of an independent country. Northern Sudan, it's different. I mean, people there perhaps don't fully understand either the extent or the strength of southern feeling on this matter, or the implications for the future. And in many ways, a split between the two will be a bigger challenge for the north, even than the south. But as I said, I think the principle is that people are recognizing the reality of the situation. It is going to happen, and they somehow have to make it work. And I think that is the spirit of the framework agreement you mentioned that was agreed just now in Khartoum. It's realistic. It lists all the difficult areas, not so much for the conduct of the referendum, but the post-referendum arrangements, because that, in a way, is the next challenge, is what do you do after people have voted? There's a huge amount of work to do, not just demarcating the boundaries, but establishing how these two countries can live in peace with each other, with one of the longest land borders in Africa, with a complex economic interdependence, both at the level of important natural resources like oil, but also in terms of the everyday life of the people who live along that border, many of whom are pastoralists and move back and forth across it. And all these things are mentioned, and I think now we've perhaps moved into a phase of more realistic negotiation between the parties, and more explicit acceptance of what actually is bound to happen.
What's your view, Mr. Shoush? Will this be a peaceful referendum?
We are hoping that it will be a peaceful referendum. And we are trying everything possible. I mean, the Sudan government is doing everything possible to make it peaceful. One of the conditions to make it peaceful is for the two sides to agree on the boundaries and to settle the question of Abyei. Without that, I don't say that it's going to be a problem, but I'm going to say that there is a possibility that they might become some problem. That's why the Sudan government, the head of the commission, are doing everything in their power to convince the SPLM to delay it for a few weeks or a few months. But I don't think the SPLM is going to agree at all to any delay.
Well, as you've just mentioned, Mr. Shoush,